Okay. Don't touch the remote yet. Just hit mute.
Uh,
I just need a second. I need to stare at the scrolling ticker and just like let it sink in. Make sure I'm not hallucinating.
you are not hallucinating, babe.
Yep.
The sea of red is very, very real. The market is not pleased.
I'm not pleased. I feel like I just watched the trailer for a huge summer blockbuster, explosions, car chases, the works. And then the movie itself was a 3-hour C-SPAN special on administrative law.
See, that's where we differ. I found the administrative law part absolutely riveting.
Of course you did.
But I know what you wanted. You wanted the cut. You were waiting for that little dopamine hit of rates are down, money is cheap, let's go buy a boat.
I do not want a boat. I want to refinance our mortgage. And as of today, that is definitively off the table for the foreseeable future.
Mm-hmm.
But seriously, are you okay? You were perched on the edge of the cushion for that whole Q&A. You looked like someone was telling you a ghost story.
Honestly, I'm a little shaken. And not by the numbers. We can crunch the numbers all day. It was the atmosphere, the feeling in that room. Did you see Powell's face?
He looked tired, like really tired.
No, not just tired. He looked besieged. He looked like a man standing on a tiny little island, and the tide is just rising on all sides. The sharks were circling him.
Okay, the reporters were definitely more aggressive today. It's usually so dry, right? Mr. Chairman, could you please comment on the dual mandate in relation to the Phillips curve?
Mm-hmm.
Today it was, Mr. Chairman, are you about to be fired? And, Mr. Chairman, why were you lurking around the Supreme Court?
Exactly. That tension, that wasn't just, economic anxiety about interest rates. That felt bigger. It felt like constitutional anxiety. Like we were watching a pivotal moment for the institution itself, not just a quarterly financial update.
Wow.
It wasn't about the basis points today. Not really. It was about whether the Federal Reserve, as we know it, is going to survive the year.
Okay, that is heavy. We are absolutely going to unpack that, the whole existential threat angle, because that back and forth about the Supreme Court was wild.
It was.
But before we spiral down that political thriller rabbit hole, we should probably, set the table for anyone who didn't just spend their entire afternoon glued to a live broadcast like we did.
Yeah.
What is the big flashing headline here?
The headline is The Hold.
The great anticlimax.
The Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, voted unanimously to hold the federal funds rate steady.
Meaning no change.
No change. Rates are staying in that target range of 3.5% to 3.75%.
Which is exactly where we've been since, December? And it hurts. It physically hurts because we had such a good rhythm going there. Remember late 2025?
I do.
September, November, December. It was cut, 75 basis points of glorious relief. And we all thought, okay, this is it. We're on the glide path. We're headed down to 3%.
And then the economy woke up and chose violence.
It really, really did. But this decision to hold, it just feels like a splash of ice water to the face. Powell kept using that phrase, solid footing. The economy is on solid footing. But if the footing is so solid, why couldn't they just give us a little treat, a quarter point, just to keep the momentum going?
Because solid footing, in this context, is actually code. It's code for overheating in ways we don't fully understand and are frankly a little scared of.
You think so?
John, if you look at the GDP numbers he was talking about, they couldn't cut. It would have been malpractice. If they had cut rates today with the economy growing at this pace, they would have been pouring gasoline on a bonfire.
I know you're right, logically. But it just feels so contradictory. We have this booming growth on paper, but everyone I talk to, my brother, the guys at the gym, people at work, everyone feels broke.
And that is the great paradox. That's the vibes versus data war that we've been tracking for a year now. But today, Powell actually gave us a map of the battlefield. He really broke down why we feel so broke, even when the headline number looks so good. But before we get to the GDP shocker, and it was a shocker, we have to talk about the opening act.
Oh, God. Please no. The video.
We have to talk about Ian.
I think I'm going to have nightmares about Ian. His dead-eyed stare, the flat lighting.
I'm Ian from the Federal Reserve.
Listen, I'm all for government transparency. I really am. But we sat there for what felt like an eternity, 20 minutes, waiting for the presser to start, and they just had that one explainer video on a loop.
It was a bit much.
It was like being in a dentist's waiting room in hell. The production value was very high school AV club.
Okay, stop being a media snob for a second. Yes, the lighting is terrible.
Bring them all.
And yes, Ian looked like he was reading off a cue card being held by a hostage taker. But did you actually listen to what he was saying?
Eventually, yeah. The Stockholm Syndrome set in around the fourth or fifth viewing.
I think they played that on purpose. It wasn't just filler content to kill time. I think it was a strategic message.
You really think so? It felt like they just had nothing else to put up.
No, absolutely. Think about the context we were just talking about. The Fed is under attack from all sides.
Right.
People are calling it an unaccountable, deep state bureaucracy that's unelected and runs the country. And right before the chairman comes out, here comes gentle, boring Ian, breaking down exactly how the system is designed with checks and balances. It was a civics lesson.
That's a really good point.
Okay.
He did really hammer home the structure, the three different entities. And I'll admit, even as someone who follows this stuff pretty closely, I sometimes get them blurred.
And that's what they're counting on people doing. So Ian broke it down, right? The Board of Governors, the 12 reserve banks, and the FOMC.
So the Board of Governors, that's the mothership in D.C.
Right. That's the actual government agency part. The 7 governors appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate.
And Ian made a really big deal about the 14-year term.
Which is the entire ballgame. 14 years. Think about that. A president gets 4, maybe 8 if they're lucky. A senator gets 6. A Fed governor gets 14.
Why, though? I mean, Ian said it's for independence, but it feels almost, I don't know, monarchical, like a lifetime appointment.
It's designed to completely decouple their decision-making from the election cycle. If your term is 14 years, you could not care less about the midterms next November. You don't have to worry about juicing the economy to help the incumbent president get reelected. You can make the hard, unpopular decisions like hiking rates and causing a recession because you're not afraid of being fired by a politician.
Theoretically.
Theoretically. So that's the D.C. political insulation layer. But then you have the second part, the 12 reserve banks.
The pulse takers, as he called them.
Exactly. And this is the part people really misunderstand. The reserve banks, New York, San Francisco, Dallas, Richmond, all of them, they aren't actually government agencies.
They're technically private corporations, right?
Right. Which is weird, but it gives them a different function. They handle the plumbing. Ian showed all that cool footage of the cash processing machines and the armored trucks.
The plumbing is important.
It's vital.
Yeah.
They make sure banks have cash, they supervise the local banks in their district, and, most importantly, they gather on-the-ground data. The president of the Dallas Fed knows more about oil prices than anyone in D.C. will ever know.
And the Kansas City Fed president knows agriculture.
Exactly. They bring that regional texture to the conversation.
So you've got the D.C. academics, the governors, and you've got the regional business guys, the reserve bank presidents, and they all come together to form Voltron.
The FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, the actual group that met today to set rates.
And this is where the trouble starts, because Ian talked about the dual mandate like it was this beautiful, harmonious marriage.
Maximum employment and price stability. It sounds so nice and simple in an animated video.
In reality, right now, those two mandates are in a steel cage match. They are fighting to the death.
They absolutely are. And that was the entire subtext of Powell's opening statement. He kept seesawing between the two. He'd say, the labor market is softening.
Which is mandate 1 screaming for a rate cut.
And then in the next breath, but inflation remains elevated.
Which is mandate 2 screaming for a rate hike, or at least a hold. Usually it's simple, right? The economy slows down, unemployment goes up, inflation drops. So both mandates point in the same direction. Cut rates, easy.
Or the economy is booming, unemployment is low, inflation is rising. Both mandates say hike rates, also easy.
But we're stuck in this horrible, messy noodle, a softening labor market and sticky, elevated inflation. One boss is yelling cut, and the other is yelling hold. And Powell's just standing there, frozen.
Which perfectly explains the decision to do nothing. It was the path of least resistance.
Okay, so that's the logic. But let's dig into the why behind the conflict.
Yeah.
Because the data he presented, Stella, that GDP number.
I gasped. I actually gasped out loud.
I think the entire market gasped. He confirmed Q3 GDP at 4.4%.
Which is already huge, a really strong number.
But then he let it slip in the Q&A. The nowcast for Q4, the quarter we just finished.
He said it had a 5 handle.
A 5 handle, 5% growth in the United States of America. Well, we aren't some developing nation that just discovered electricity. We're a mature, saturated, 200-year-old economy. Growing at 5% is, I mean, that's like 1990s dot-com boom level stuff.
It is genuinely staggering, and you could see Powell leaning on that. That was his shield. The economy is on solid footing, and if you just look at that one number, he's absolutely right.
He is.
A 5% economy does not need a rate cut. A 5% economy, if anything, usually needs a rate hike to stop it from just completely boiling over.
So then why does everything feel so bad? If the economy is booming at 5%, why is my brother terrified of losing his job? Why are people I know trading down to the store brand peanut butter?
Because the growth is incredibly wildly uneven. This is the K-shaped recovery we talked about, but on steroids.
Right.
And Powell actually addressed this head on. It was when Christine Romans from NBC asked him about that disconnect.
The vibes question.
The vibes question. The president says everything is awesome, but the people on the street say everything is expensive and scary. And Powell's answer was so telling. He talked about the wealth effect.
Okay, break that down for me again.
The wealth effect is this classic economic idea that when people feel richer, they spend more money, even if their income hasn't changed.
Okay.
So who feels richer right now? People who own assets.
Homeowners.
Exactly. Home prices are at or near record highs. You open up your Zillow app, you see your net worth has gone up by 50 grand, you feel secure. You're more likely to go out to dinner.
Stockholders.
The S&P 500 is flirting with all-time highs. If you have a 401k, you open the statement and it looks great.
So the top, 40% of the country, the asset owners?
They are spending like there's no tomorrow. They're booking the European vacations, they're buying the new cars, they're renovating their kitchens. That is what is driving that 5% GDP number. It's the spending of the affluent.
But the other 60%?
The people who rent. The people who live paycheck to paycheck and don't have a stock portfolio the size of a phone book.
Yeah.
They're not getting any of the wealth effect. They're just getting the price effect.
They're just seeing that a carton of eggs costs $6.
Precisely. And Powell admitted it. He said retailers who serve lower and middle income demographics are reporting weakness and trading down behavior. So you have this completely bifurcated economy. The rich are partying and driving the GDP through the roof, and the working class is pulling back and buying generic cereal.
And that's the trap for the Fed, isn't it?
It's a nightmare scenario for them.
If they cut rates to help the working class with their car loans and credit card debt, the rich people with the stocks will just spend even more, and that will push inflation even higher.
But if they raise rates to stop the rich people from spending, they'll completely crush the working class who are already struggling. They'll trigger a wave of defaults.
So they do nothing. They just sit on their hands and pray it all sorts itself out.
We remain data dependent. It's the safest thing a central banker can say.
Okay, let's talk about the inflation part of this K-shape. Because there was a really specific, almost granular detail Powell mentioned that I think explains so much of the frustration people are feeling, the split between goods and services.
Yes, this was, for me, a pivotal moment in the entire press conference, because for the last 2 years, the whole story has been about services inflation.
Right. Rent, car insurance, health insurance, going out to eat. That's what was getting so expensive.
And Powell delivered some genuinely good news on that front today. He said services inflation is finally cooling. It's dropping. The disinflationary process, as he calls it, is actually working there.
But there's always a but.
But goods inflation, which had been falling for a year, has woken up from the dead and is now spiking.
So physical stuff.
Yeah.
Clothes, electronics, cars, furniture.
And he didn't mince words about why. He drew a direct causal link. He explicitly connected it to tariffs.
The T word. He said the quiet part out loud.
He said, and I'm quoting here, "These elevated readings largely reflect inflation in the goods sector, which has been boosted by the effects of tariffs."
That is about as direct as a Fed chair ever gets. He's basically looking at the camera and saying, hey, Congress, hey, White House, don't look at me. I did my job. I raised rates. The reason your new iPhone is so expensive is because you guys slapped a big tax on it.
It's the most polite way imaginable of saying, fiscal policy is actively fighting monetary policy, and it's making my job impossible.
But Powell has a theory about this, and I really want to know if you buy it. He called it a level shift.
Ah, yes. The classic economist distinction. He's arguing that the tariffs will cause a one-time jump in the price level, but not a sustained increase in the rate of inflation.
Explain that. That sounds like jargon.
Okay, imagine you're walking down a gently sloped street. That street is 2% inflation. It's a nice, easy walk.
Okay.
Suddenly, you get to a curb. You have to step up 6 inches to get onto the sidewalk. That 6-inch step is the tariff. It's a sudden, one-time increase. Once you're on the sidewalk, you're 6 inches higher than you were before. But the sidewalk itself is also a gentle slope. You're not continuously climbing a ladder. The painful part was the step up.
So prices go up once, they stay at that new, higher level, but they stop going up further and further each month.
That's a level shift It's painful when it happens, but in their models, it's not inflation in the sense of a continuous, self-perpetuating spiral. Powell believes this tariff shock will work its way through the system, peak around the middle of 2026, and then just wash out of the year-over-year numbers.
That sounds incredibly optimistic.
It's very optimistic.
Because Richard Escobedo from CBS asked a fantastic follow-up question. He pointed out that, trade policy is in flux.
Exactly. It's not a settled issue.
It's not one single curb that we all step over and then we're done. The administration announces a new tariff on one country, then threatens another one, then changes the rate on a third one. It feels less like stepping up a curb and more like we're trying to walk up a staircase that is actively being built right in front of us, and we don't know how many steps there are.
That is the danger. That's the risk to his forecast. If the tariffs keep changing, or if other countries retaliate and then we tariff them back, you don't get a neat little level shift. You get an inflationary spiral. And he did admit that the pass-through from tariffs to consumer prices is very high right now.
Pass-through. That's the nice, polite term for companies are not eating this cost. They're giving the entire bill to us.
Right. In some economic environments, a company might say, okay, there's a 10% tariff, but we want to keep our customers, so we'll just take lower profits and only raise our price by 5%.
Right.
Powell said that is not happening now. The importers, the middlemen, the retailers, they are passing 100% of that cost straight through to you and me at the checkout counter.
Which, that connects directly to our personal budget.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
We have been talking for months about getting a new TV for the bedroom.
And maybe upgrading our laptops. They're getting a little slow.
Based on what Chairman Powell just said,
yeah,
if we wait, we lose.
I think you're absolutely right. If this pass-through is going to be peaking in the middle of this year, that means prices for these imported goods are climbing right now. Waiting 6 months means that TV could be 10 or 15% more expensive.
So, ironically, the Fed holding rates steady, which usually makes me want to save my money because I can get a decent return, is actually making me want to spend. I want to buy the physical goods now before the tariff level shift smacks my wallet.
But that's the inflationary psychology they are absolutely terrified of.
I know.
If everyone thinks like you, and they should, then everyone rushes out to Best Buy and Walmart this weekend to buy stuff before it gets more expensive. That creates a huge spike in demand, and what do retailers do when demand spikes? They raise prices even faster.
Look, I'm not trying to solve for the macroeconomy, Stella. I am trying to solve for the Smith-Chin-Harper household economy.
Fair enough. It looks like we're going to Best Buy this weekend.
Done. But while we're talking about spending money, let's talk about earning money. Because the labor market data he went through, it is so weird.
Stabilizing. That his word of the day. A very carefully chosen neutral word.
Unemployment is at 4.4%.
Which, historically is not a disaster. That's a pretty healthy number.
But the direction of travel is the problem. And that net job gains number is just frightening.
It's basically a statistical zero.
He said 29,000 net new jobs were added in the private sector last month. In a country of 330 million people, 29,000 is a rounding error. It's statistical noise. It means nothing is happening.
It confirms that theory we've been hearing about, the job lossless slowdown.
Okay, explain that for everyone, because I think this is precisely what people are feeling in their own offices and workplaces right now.
Okay, so in a normal classic recession, when the economy slows down, companies panic and they fire people, you see big layoff announcements, unemployment claims spike, and the unemployment rate shoots up.
Right. We all know what that looks like.
That isn't what's happening now. If you look at the data for initial jobless claims, it's still very low. Companies are hoarding their workers.
Why?
Because they all remember how incredibly hard it was to hire people back in 2022 and 2023. They went through hiring hell, and they don't want to fire anyone they might need to rehire in 6 months.
So if you have a job, you're probably safe for now.
Relatively speaking, yes. But, and this is the big but, they aren't hiring anyone new. The quits rate is way down because people are scared to leave their jobs. The hiring rate is way down. The front door of the company is basically locked and bolted.
So it's like a game of musical chairs, and the music just stopped. If you're in a chair, great. Don't you dare move. But if you were standing up when the music stopped.
If you're a new college graduate, if you got laid off and are trying to get back in, if you're trying to switch careers, good luck. You are staring at a brick wall right now.
Which brings us perfectly to the tech segment of the presser.
Oh.
Because there is a very specific, very new reason why companies can have 5% GDP growth without hiring any new people.
The robots are here.
The AI build-out. I have to say, I love this part because usually the Fed is so backward-looking, they're always talking about lagging indicators from 6 months ago. But Powell was surprisingly forward-looking and, frankly, bullish on AI.
He specifically credited the build-out of data centers as a major driver of that strong GDP number. And it makes sense when you think about it.
It does.
All that construction for new data centers, the high-tech HVAC systems, the upgrades to the energy grids, the server racks themselves, the fiber optic cables, that is billions and billions of dollars of corporate investment, and that pumps up GDP.
But, and this is the key, it doesn't necessarily employ a lot of people once it's actually built. A massive data center can be run by like 12 engineers and a security guard.
Exactly. And Christine Romans, again, asked the darker side of that question. She asked, is AI killing entry-level jobs?
And he didn't dodge it. I was expecting a lot of, well, the data is unclear, we're monitoring the situation. But he said, we see a connection.
That was such a validating moment for so many young people, but also a deeply terrifying one. He admitted that hiring for new college grads is soft, and it's likely because AI is now capable of doing those routine cognitive drudgery tasks.
Right. Writing basic code, summarizing long documents, writing first drafts of marketing copy.
All the stuff you used to hire a 22-year-old right out of college to do, now you just pay $20 a month for a software subscription.
But from a pure economist perspective, Powell loves this. He kept using the word productivity.
The holy grail of economics.
Because if you can produce more output, more GDP, with fewer hours of human labor, that is the literal definition of creating wealth for society. It means, in theory, that wages can go up without causing inflation because you're more efficient.
But that's a very long-term, rosy transition. In the short term, in the here and now, it means a job-lossless slowdown where corporate profits soar, the GDP number looks fantastic, and the junior analyst who just graduated with 100 grand in debt is driving for Uber.
It's a really harsh reality. And it connects right back to our real-life connection, our strategy. If the labor market is truly frozen like this,
you hunker down.
This is not the year to get mad at your boss and rage quit, is it?
Absolutely not. Right now, stability is your most valuable asset. If you have a steady paycheck, you hold on to it with both hands. You do not jump ship unless you have a signed, sealed, delivered offer letter with a start date, because the water in the hiring pool is very, very shallow right now.
Okay, so the household plan is buy the TV, but keep the job.
That is the plan.
All right? We have covered the strange bifurcated economy. Now we have to cover the drama. Because the real heat, the real tension in that room today, it wasn't about AI or tariffs. It was about the Supreme Court.
The Citron case. The Lisa Cook case, as he referred to it.
I have to be honest, I had totally missed this story until today. But the way Powell was talking about it, you'd think it was the apocalypse.
He called it perhaps the most important legal case in the Fed's 113-year history.
113 years. That goes back to the literal founding of the institution. What is this case about?
John, the case is challenging the fundamental constitutionality of the Fed's independence from the president. Specifically, it's challenging the for-cause removal protection for Fed governors.
Okay, I need a quick civics refresher. For cause means the president can't just fire a Fed governor because he doesn't like their policies, right?
Correct.
He has to have a legitimate legal reason, like they committed a crime or were grossly negligent in their duties.
Exactly. The lawsuit argues that because the Fed makes policy that affects the entire country, they are part of the executive branch, and therefore the president should be able to fire them at will for any reason, just like he can fire the Secretary of Commerce.
And if the Supreme Court agrees with that argument,
then the independence of the Federal Reserve is dead. It's over. The moment a president doesn't like that interest rates are high heading into an election, he fires the chair, appoints a political loyalist, and orders them to cut rates to zero.
And that's what Powell was pushing back against so hard. He gave that little impromptu speech about fiscal dominance. Did you hear the shift in his voice when he was talking about that?
Oh, I did. He stopped sounding like a dry banker, and he started sounding like a passionate historian. He said, every advanced democracy in the world separates the power to print money from the power of elected politics.
But why? What's the fundamental danger there?
The danger is the sugar high. If a politician has direct control over the money printer, the temptation to abuse it is almost irresistible. An election is coming up. Just print a bunch of money, lower rates to zero, make everyone feel rich and happy right before they vote.
And then, after the election, the politician wins, and 6 months later the bill comes due, and you have hyperinflation, and the currency completely collapses.
It has happened over and over and over again throughout history. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Argentina, Venezuela, Even the United States in the 1970s struggled with immense political pressure on the Fed.
And that's why he invoked the name of the patron saint.
He brought up Paul Volcker, the patron saint of central banking.
Powell admitted that he went to the Supreme Court hearing for this case personally to sit in the audience. And when a reporter asked why, he said, Paul Volcker did the same thing in 1985.
That is such a power move. Volcker is the legendary Fed chair who broke the back of inflation in the early 80s. He was hated for it. People mailed him 2x4s in the mail because he destroyed the housing market by raising rates so high, but he saved the US dollar. By invoking Volcker, Powell is wrapping himself in that legacy. He's sending a message. I am the guardian of the currency, and I am under attack.
But it's not just the court that's attacking him. It's Congress. It's the Senate.
The Tillis blockade.
Right. Elizabeth Scholes from the ADC brought this up. Senator Tillis is single-handedly blocking all the President Biden's Fed nominees from getting a confirmation vote.
It's a political hostage situation. The Fed board is shrinking because members are retiring and they can't get anyone new confirmed, which makes Powell's job even harder.
And then on top of all that, you have the resignation rumors. Michael McKee from Bloomberg.
Oh, McKee, he is a sniper. He doesn't waste a question.
He looked Powell dead in the eye and just asked, point blank, Mr. Chairman, have you decided whether you will resign?
And Powell immediately went into what I call gray rock mode, just total shutdown.
I have nothing for you on that today.
It was so icy, but you notice what he didn't say.
He didn't say no.
He did not say no. That's what haunts me. If he was 100% committed to staying, the easy answer is, I intend to serve my full term as mandated by law. By saying, I have nothing for you, he's keeping the door open to leaving, or he's in the middle of a negotiation.
Or he's just completely and utterly exhausted by it all.
That too. Which brings us to the very last question of the day. Matt Egan from CNN. What is your advice to your eventual successor?
That was the moment that gave me chills.
Stay out of elected politics.
He said it was such weight, such gravity. Stay out of elected politics. Don't do it. It didn't sound like advice. It sounded like a desperate warning from a man who's been through the trenches.
It makes you realize that while the rest of us are sitting here worrying about 3.5% versus 3.25% interest rates, Jerome Powell is lying awake at night, worrying about whether the entire institution he leads will even exist in its current form in a few years.
And that's the scary part, isn't it? We all just take the US dollar for granted. We assume our money has value. But money is just a social construct. It's based on trust. It's faith in the independence and credibility of the institution that issues it.
And if that institution becomes just another political arm of the White House, controlled by partisan whims,
The faith evaporates overnight.
and then you don't have 3% inflation anymore, you have 30% inflation, or 300%.
So the stakes are,
Yeah,
they're actually existential.
they really are.
Okay, wow. Let's try to land this plane. We've covered the solid but K-shaped economy, the tariff level shift theory, the AI-driven job lossless weirdness, and the looming constitutional crisis. Let's grade the man. How do you grade Chairman Powell's performance today?
I'm going first on this one. I'm giving him an A-.
An A-, even though he just made sure our mortgage stays expensive for another year.
I'm grading on the degree of difficulty. He is walking a tightrope in the middle of a hurricane. He has the Supreme Court on one side, a hostile Senate on the other, completely contradictory economic data, and sticky inflation. And in the face of all of that, he held the line. He defended the institution without picking a political fight he couldn't win. He was disciplined, calm, and clear.
You respect the trade craft.
I really do. It was a masterclass in deflection and institutional defense.
Okay, I'm going to be a little tougher. I'm giving him a B+.
Oh, why the deduction from Professor Smith?
I think his level shift theory on tariffs is a huge gamble. I think he's being too optimistic. He's hoping that prices will stabilize, but hope is not a monetary policy strategy. If he's wrong, and the tariffs do trigger a wage price spiral, then holding rates steady today will look like a massive mistake in hindsight. I think he should have been more aggressive in publicly warning the administration about the inflationary costs of their trade policy.
But he can't do that. That would violate his own #1 rule. Stay out of elected politics. He can't directly critique the president's policies.
He could have been louder and more direct about the source of goods inflation in his main statement, not just in the Q&A. But still, a B+ is a solid passing grade. It was a very competent performance under pressure.
So for everyone listening, what's the action plan? What do we do now?
Action plan item number 1. Accept that the housing market is basically dead for 2026. Don't stress about Zillow. Don't dream about refinancing. Just close the app. Right. Mortgage rates aren't dropping in any meaningful way anytime soon.
Action plan item number 2. If you have a big ticket purchase to make that involves imported goods, electronics, a car, appliances, do it sooner rather than later. The tariff pass-through is real, and those prices are likely heading up.
And action plan item number 3, cherish your job. The solid footing of the economy is only solid if you're standing on it with a paycheck. This is not the time to test the hiring market. Hunker down.
And I'll leave you with one final thought. Keep an eye on that Supreme Court case. Citron v. Federal Reserve. I know it sounds unbelievably boring, but it might actually be the single most important economic story of the entire year.
Because if the independence of the Fed falls...
We are all going to need a lot more than a deep dive to figure out what comes next.
Well, on that terrifyingly cheerful note, I think I'm going to go turn off the TV and pretend the world is simple for a few hours.
I'm going to go online and check the price of that 65-inch OLED TV at Best Buy.
Good call. Thanks for hanging out with us for this deep dive, everyone.
We'll see you next time.
Don't spend too much.